Good afternoon again, everyone. It is my distinct honor today. We have the President of Iceland with us here, President Olafur Ragnar Grimsson. He's the 5th President of Iceland and the longest serving head of state. He's been very active and a leader in both green energy and climate issues. He will be speaking on the Borlaug Dialogue stage tomorrow, giving the keynote address at 9:30, and he has graciously given some time to answer questions from the press. So if you would like to join us over here, without further ado, I will introduce President Grimsson from Iceland.
Good afternoon.
Are there questions from people?
No, let me say
sorry,
a few
I'm
words.
sorry.
Let me first say a few words about my core message here at the World Food Prize and the Borlaug Dialogue tomorrow. I just came from Iceland, where we hosted over the weekend, in fact, also on Monday, the largest international gathering on the Arctic, the first assembly of the Arctic Circle, attended by over 1,000 participants for over 40 countries. And among the core issues on the agenda was how the melting of the Arctic sea ice is influencing and creating extreme weather patterns in Asia, in the Americas and elsewhere, destroying food production, infrastructure, and having various other disastrous consequences for the livelihood of people, for farmers, for agriculture, and societies. This was made clear earlier this year when the melting of the Arctic sea ice last year caused the most severe destruction in China during winter in living memory. To give you one example, freezing over 200,000 cattle to death out in the field. It's a dramatic demonstration of the connection between the melting of the ice in my part of the world and the global food crisis, and the connection between the ice, the food, and the need for transformation in our energy systems. So my talk tomorrow is titled The Triangle Ice, Energy, Food, because I believe that unless we make that connection, it will be very difficult to transform the policy making, the debate on what is ahead in the coming years and decades. Greenland is the closest neighbor to Iceland. There, the ice sheet is melting faster than ever. If only a quarter of the Greenland ice sheet melts, it will raise sea levels globally everywhere, for every city, every continent, for over 2 meters. We all come from civilizations, nations, and educational system where the ice has not really been on the agenda, where the ice has been peripheral, somewhere far away, no need to actually discuss it. So my mission here is to try to make the connection between what's happening to the ice in the Arctic, in Antarctica, and also in the Himalayas, the need for clean energy transformation, and how we can use that connection to transform the global food situation. It's a strange connection, which most people think is really so far out that they don't really comprehend why I'm making it. I will answer that in 2 or 3 minutes before I take questions. Mankind's oldest method of preserving food has been to dry it. That's what people did in my country, in Asia and Africa over the centuries. Unless you dried the food outdoors, you were not able to have enough throughout the year. But It was done outdoors. It took a long time, many months. We also know that all over Asia, Africa, the Americans and elsewhere, up to 20% of the food produced gets destroyed within a week because it cannot be preserved. And then I'm not talking about wasted food. I'm talking about food that gets destroyed within a week because there is no way where it is being produced or consumed to actually preserve it. We here in the United States and in my country in Europe, we preserve food through freezing it. But there is no such infrastructure in most parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and even if it were so, and we introduced it, the consequences for the climate would be disastrous. So, in order to make the single most important contribution to global food security in the coming years, here and now, we need to find a way to preserve what we already produce, instead of having it destroyed within a week because of the heat. And it can be done. And in fact, it's so simple that most people don't pay attention to it. I didn't pay attention to it for over a decade, although it was staring me in the face and was in front of me. Because in Iceland for the last 30 years, we have been taking fish heads, backbones, the things we threw away into the ocean before because we only exported the fillets of the fish, and we brought it into drying facilities where we used geothermal, and we dried it for 5 days in an airtight room, each one the size of a garage, 30 degrees centigrade with a circulating air. And if you dry it for 5 days, and you can also do it, as we have proved in my country, for meat, for vegetable, for fruits, or whatever type of food product, you can preserve it for up to 2 years with zero infrastructure. And I will say that again, zero infrastructure. Most people don't get that when I say it, because we are so accustomed to solutions having to be high-tech, investment demanding, and complicated. So the fish heads and the backbones that are such in this way dried in my country are then exported to Nigeria. We could export it elsewhere, but there's a sufficient market there. And it's brought to the street vendors in the mud streets, the women who sell it, to make a good living out of it. And they can keep it in the sacks just there on the mud street for up to 2 years if they haven't sold it before then, but usually it gets sold before. And then you only make a stew because the only thing you need is water to boil and some vegetable and things that you throw into it. And this can also be done with solar energy, localized solar energy, wind energy, or any kind of localized resource in a village, in a community, in any kind of size, big or small, for any kind of food production, whatever. And in the last 12 months or so, I've been trying to get together an informal coalition, quite successfully, of the FAO, UNDP, IRENA, the New Clean Energy Association, with strong support from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and many others, to do, for a period of 24 months, a trial project in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, in order to demonstrate to people that this can actually be done, because most people are so skeptical of it because it's so simple and elementary that you have to tell them that it can be done. So in a nutshell, the reason why I have traveled all the way from Iceland to be with you here, coming straight for this conference on the Arctic, to talk about the world food situation, is to bring forward this connection between the ice, the melting of the ice, the need for a clean energy transformation, and how that clean energy transformation can be used to enhance global food security in a way that no other method, and I say that also again, no other method can do as cheaply, as effectively, and as quickly as a comprehensive drying of food products everywhere in the world. Okay. So now I will take any kind of questions you want to put. Yes.
That seems like that would work. Oh, thank you. That would work well in a low humidity environment. But what do you do in a area where the ambient humidity is in the 50 to 99% range? And then my second question is another alternative, which really was introduced in the early 60s and has been ignored, is irradiation of food. And I'm wondering if you have thought on either of those two issues.
Well, I'm no expert on radiation of food, so I'm not going to speak about that. But with respect to your first question, if you look at what we have done in the last 2 years, where people dry food and have done so for decades or even centuries, you would be surprised in how many countries in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, the practice of drying meat and fish has been common for a long time in their localized climate that varies on a great deal, whether it is from some of the Asian countries over to some of the African countries. But like we did it in my country in previous times, it takes months, it takes a long time. And it has a lot of waste associated with it, and it's not effective. So this is simply a proposition to make the similar transformation as we did from our local practices to communities, farmers and fishermen in different countries, different climates, different situations. You might be right. I'm not saying you are wrong in your question. But the essence of this trial project in these different countries in the next 24 months or so is to find out and do the localized experiments, but also to sell the products on the market, because the essence of this is not subsidies. The essence of this is profitable business for the local farmers and the fishermen and for like the women in Nigeria who sell the Icelandic product. They make a good living out of that, perhaps a better living than they could make any other way. So this is not a proposition to subsidize enhanced food security, but to use the market and the practice of the clean energy localized technologies to enable people to earn a living as well as preserving the food we already produce. And my question is really simple, as I've asked many people. Can you give me any other method that will help us to preserve the food we already produce with so little cost, as effectively, and for such a long time? And until somebody comes to me and gives me another method that can answer these questions, I will keep on bringing together this broad international, informal, I emphasize that, informal coalition to demonstrate that this can be done. Okay, yeah.
My name is Ken Root. I'm an agricultural news reporter, and I wonder if you would comment, being that you have a nation called Iceland, that the areas closer to the poles will be more affected by climate change than those in the tropics. And if so, what are you doing in your country to be ready for climate change?
Well, with all due respect, your question is based on a very common misconception. The misconception that the melting of the ice in my part of the world, in the Arctic, only affects us in the Arctic. The Chinese Polar Institute has, in the last few years, been doing extensive research on the Arctic sea ice, because they discovered that the extreme weather patterns in China in the winter of 2007 to 2008, which destroyed an enormous amount of agriculture and infrastructure of electricity and railways and communication, was primarily caused by the melting of the Arctic sea ice. Similarly, American scientists have shown that the melting of the Arctic sea ice causes extreme weather patterns, including Storm Sandy, partly in the United States. And these scientific findings of the linking of the aggressive melting of the Arctic sea ice to weather patterns all over Asia and the Americas is one of the most fundamental connections, demonstrating how the melting of the ice in faraway places affects immediately, meaning within few months, the weather patterns all over the world. What we have, however, seen is that the melting of the ice in the Arctic, in Greenland, and in my own country, Iceland has the largest glaciers in Europe, as you might be aware of, is now 2 or 3 times faster than in other parts of the world. So the rate of the warming and the climate change affecting the ice is 2 to 3 times faster in my part of the world. That is why global shipping companies are now looking at the so-called Northern Sea route along Russia and along the North Pole to transport cargo from Asia to America and Europe instead of going through the Suez Canal for at least 3 or 4 months of the year. And that's one of the reasons why I put a lot of effort in creating this international gathering, the Arctic Circle, that met in my country a few days ago. And the reason why the people and officials from South Korea, Singapore, China, India, as well as France and Germany and the Arctic countries were there, is that now increasingly both governmental leaders, business leaders, scientists are aware of this connection. And this has led me to try to bring it together in a few words, which go as follows. We all now live in an ice-dependent world. We all now live in an ice-dependent world. And it is a perception shift that we have to make, because my generation was brought up in an educational system which taught us that the ice was of no importance whatsoever to our economies, to our lives, to the weather system, and everything else. So to make the shift that we all now live in an ice-dependent world is perhaps similar to making the shift from thinking the Earth was flat over to realizing what is its actual shape. And the weather patterns, the food production, the economies in Asia and the Americans and elsewhere will be more affected by what happens to the ice in my part of the world, including the Arctic and the Greenland, than perhaps by anything else in the next 20 or 30 years. So it is of paramount importance that we go through this shift, and our political dialogue, our economies, our thinking about food and the weather, our cities as well, will be influenced by this. And maybe since the term climate change has become politically difficult, especially in this country, it might help us to start looking at this from the perspective of our ice-dependent world. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Larry Dreiling. I am with a magazine called High Plains Journal, which serves the middle of the United States. It's primarily wheat and cattle country, and they use a lot of diesel fuel, use a lot of gasoline. They are a very, very dependent economy on fossil fuels. What do you say to one of my farmers who is a fossil fuel dependent farmer, that it looks like as climate changes, we're going to have to reduce our reliance on those fossil fuels, and also maybe even change the way eating habits occur, and therefore we'll have to look at food production habits changing?
Well, I would tell him a few things. First of all, I would tell him I was brought up in an economy, the Icelandic economy, which for the first 20 years of my life was over 80% dependent on fossil fuel. The communities I grew up in, everything depended on fossil fuel. The heating, the electricity, everything. The fishing boats, the cars, everything. So during my lifetime, we have moved from being 80% dependent on fossil fuel over to reaching 100% clean energy in electricity and house heating production. This is giving our farmers enormous opportunities to become richer, more affluent, and to broaden their scope of earnings by using cheap electricity and cheap heat produced by localized as well as national clean energy resources in a very effective way. And it has enabled them also to make the linkage between clean energy and agricultural products sold both in our own market and in foreign markets on the basis of the informed consumer now ask the question, how was the food produced? What was the carbon footprint that created the food? And as you might have heard, Iceland suffered a banking crisis in 2008, like some other countries. We were for a while considered perhaps exhibit number one in the global financial crisis. That's why the media in other countries was interested in my country. But now we are perhaps exhibit number one of a country having successfully dealt with the financial crisis, with only 4% unemployment, with economic growth, and with a general prosperity for most of the people, although there are still problems that you don't find in the other countries that suffer a financial crisis. One of the major reasons why we came so quickly out of the financial crisis, both for the farmers and the fishermen and every other community in our country, was the clean energy transformation. So the homes, the businesses, the farmers, the fishing communities didn't have to pay high prices and didn't suffer the similar shocks as people have in many other European countries where they have to depend on fossil fuel and oil and gas for their economies. The fundamental lesson, as I will try to explain tomorrow, from the history of my country, including the food-producing sectors like the farmers and the fishermen, is that clean energy is fundamentally a very good business. We don't treat it as a subsidized sector. We treat it as a fundamental pillar of a successful 21st century globalized economy. So I would try to tell them the real story of my own country and then let them draw their own conclusion, whether it is not also in their own interest, long term, to make the transformation. Let me tell you a story that they might also find interesting. 12 years ago, I took the president of China, then Jiang Zemin, to a geothermal power plant in Iceland. The president of China had never been to a geothermal power plant. So he went back to China, and to cut a long story short, we started a cooperation with China, which is now based on taking one district after another, one city after another, and closing down the coal-driven urban heating system and replacing it with clean energy, localized geothermal energy for the Chinese cities. But a few months ago, the Chinese came back to us and said, we have noticed in Iceland, the farmers use the geothermal and the heat and the clean energy to grow agricultural products in greenhouses, where you control the environment completely, you don't use pesticides, you don't use any chemicals, and it's done in a pure way. It's very costly for us to transport food products from southern China to northern China. So now we want to look at the possibility of building huge geothermal plantations under glass in greenhouses in northern China in order to allow the farming community in that part of China to become as successfully involved in the food production business in the 21st century as the farmers in the southern part of China. So there is a multitude of stories like this that prove on the ground, locally, that it is actually in the business interest of the farming sector and individual farmers to look closely at making this transformation, as we have done, sooner rather than later. Okay. So, if there are no more questions, then I thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for inviting me here, and I'm looking forward to see some of you at least tomorrow, where I will try to explain this approach in greater detail. Thank you.